The smell of ozone filled the air as holographic displays flickered to life across the Academy's main lecture hall. Rows of alien cadets from dozens of worlds shifted in their specially designed seats, each accommodation crafted for different anatomies and breathing requirements. Some floated in suspension pods filled with methane gas, while others perched on heated stone platforms that mimicked their desert homeworlds. Professor Kalen adjusted his ancient spectacles and surveyed the classroom with 6 compound eyes. His Valdorian heritage showed in every deliberate movement, each gesture carrying the weight of 3 centuries spent studying warfare across the galaxy. Students often joked that he had personally witnessed half the conflicts he taught, though none dared say it to his face. Today felt different. The usual chatter that filled the room before lectures had died to whispers. Word had spread through the Academy's corridors about a new species joining the galactic community. Rumors claimed they called themselves humans and came from a small, blue world in an unremarkable spiral arm of the galaxy. 3 cadets sat together in the middle section, their friendship forged through 2 years of shared academic struggles. Dex belonged to the Braxi, a species that resembled upright lizards with crystalline scales that changed color with their emotions. Currently, his scales showed the deep green of curiosity mixed with amber flecks of anxiety. The Braxi had joined galactic society only 50 years ago, making them relatively newcomers themselves. Beside him sat Mira, an Alteran whose people looked almost human except for their silver skin and the bony ridges that crowned their heads like natural crowns. The Alterans had built their entire culture around concepts of honor and noble warfare, believing that how one fought mattered more than whether one won or lost. Her violet eyes never left the professor as he prepared his materials. The third member of their group was Nyx, a Nexari whose species approached everything through mathematical precision. His pale blue skin seemed to glow faintly under the classroom lights, and the geometric patterns tattooed across his arms shifted slowly as he processed information. The Nexari turned warfare into an exact science, calculating victory and defeat like mathematical equations. Professor Kalen's voice cut through the murmurs as he began the day's lesson. His words carried the weight of authority that came from having studied every major conflict in recorded galactic history. Today we begin your final project for advanced military history, he announced. You will work in groups of 3 to compile a comprehensive analysis of a species' complete military record. This assignment will account for 60% of your final grade. Excited whispers rippled through the classroom. Final projects usually involved analyzing well-known conflicts like the Zephyrian Crystal Wars or the Great Void Rebellion. Students competed for the most famous battles, knowing that extensive research already existed to guide their work. However, the professor continued, raising one clawed hand for silence. This semester presents a unique opportunity. A new species has recently made contact with our civilization. They call themselves humans, and they come from a world they name Earth. Dex's scales shifted to bright yellow with excitement. A completely fresh research topic meant no competition with previous students' work. They could potentially uncover unknown tactical innovations or unusual strategic approaches that might impress the examining board. The Galactic Defense Corps has requested a thorough analysis of this species' military capabilities and historical warfare patterns, Professor Kalen explained. Your research will contribute to official policy decisions regarding their potential membership in our defense alliance. Mira leaned forward in her seat. The possibility of influencing actual military policy sent thrills through her honor-focused mindset. This assignment offered the chance to shape galactic history rather than simply study it. I must warn you, the professor added, his tone growing serious. The human military records contain unusual elements that may challenge your understanding of conventional warfare. I encourage you to approach this research with open minds and strong stomachs. Several students laughed at what they assumed was typical academic melodrama. Professor Kalen often warned about the psychological impact of studying ancient battles, but most cadets had grown up hearing stories of their own species' conflicts. How different could another primitive species' wars really be? Nyx raised his hand, the patterns on his arms pulsing with analytical curiosity. Professor, What makes human warfare unusual compared to standard galactic patterns? The old Valdorian's eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the classroom walls. That, Cadet Nix, is what you will discover. I will say only this. Most species wage war to achieve specific objectives. Humans appear to wage war for reasons that transcend conventional military logic. The professor activated a holographic display that showed the galaxy's spiral arms. A small red dot appeared in what most species considered an insignificant region of space. Earth lies here, in what they call the Orion Spur, a single star system with one habitable world. Yet their military archives span thousands of years and contain more individual conflicts than most galactic sectors experience in a millennium. Students began forming groups immediately, but Dex, Mira, and Nix had already decided to work together. They approached the professor's desk, where he was distributing research access codes and preliminary data packets. "We would like to study the humans," Mira announced with typical Alteran directness. Professor Kalen studied the three cadets carefully. "Are you certain? I have other assignments available." The Coranian trade wars offer excellent examples of economic warfare. The Thessian rebellions demonstrate classic insurgency tactics. "We want the challenge," Dex replied, his scales now showing the steady blue of determination. "How difficult can one primitive species be to analyze?" The professor handed them a data chip marked with several warning symbols in different galactic languages. "Very well. You have 6 weeks to compile your analysis. I recommend you pace yourselves and take regular breaks from the research. Some of the material can be overwhelming." As the three cadets left the classroom, they felt the excitement that came with tackling the unknown. They had no way of knowing that they were about to encounter a species whose approach to warfare defied every assumption they held about conflict, victory, and the very nature of civilization itself. The first records they would access that evening would begin with something called the Trojan War, and their understanding of what it meant to fight would never be the same. The Academy's research chamber hummed with the low vibration of quantum processors accessing archived data from across the galaxy. Nix adjusted the environmental controls to accommodate his teammates' different atmospheric needs, while holographic displays materialized around their circular workstation. The human data chip sat in the central reader, its warning labels seeming more ominous under the chamber's blue lighting. Mira stretched her silver-skinned arms above her head, working out tension from their previous study session. "We should start with their earliest recorded conflicts," she suggested. "Most species follow similar patterns of development, from tribal warfare to organized military campaigns." Dex's scales shimmered with anticipation as he activated the first data stream. The file index shows thousands of individual conflicts. That seems excessive for a single planet, but maybe they had many separate civilizations. The holographic display filled with images and text describing something called the Siege of Troy. The three cadets leaned forward as they began reading about two groups of humans fighting over a woman named Helen, who had been taken from her husband by a prince from another city. "Wait," Nick said, his tattooed arms pulsing with confusion. "They fought for 10 years over one person?" Mira shook her head. "That cannot be accurate. No rational species would sustain a decade-long conflict over a single individual. There must have been strategic resources involved. Maybe this Helen was a military leader or possessed valuable intelligence." They dug deeper into the records, but the truth became increasingly clear. The Greeks had indeed laid siege to Troy for 10 years, sacrificing thousands of lives and enormous resources, primarily because Paris had taken Helen from her husband Menelaus. The concept of honor and revenge seemed to drive the conflict more than any practical military objective. Dex's scales turned a sickly yellow-green as he processed this information. Among the Braxi, conflicts were resolved through formal combat between champions, with clear rules and immediate outcomes. The idea of prolonging suffering for a decade over a personal slight seemed monstrous. "Look at their tactics," Nix pointed to battlefield descriptions with trembling fingers. They describe combat in terms of individual glory, rather than strategic advantage. Listen to this passage about a warrior named Achilles. The display showed accounts of Achilles dragging Hector's body around the city walls not for any military purpose but purely to inflict psychological torment on the defenders. The cadets read about warriors who fought primarily to achieve eternal fame through their deeds in battle, caring more about how they would be remembered than whether their side achieved victory. "This is barbaric," Mira whispered. Her people valued honor in combat, but always within the context of achieving worthy objectives. Fighting purely for personal glory while comrades died seemed like a perversion of everything the Alterans held sacred. They moved chronologically through human history, encountering the Persian Wars where outnumbered Greeks chose to fight hopeless battles rather than submit to foreign rule. The Battle of Thermopylae particularly disturbed them, as 300 Spartans deliberately chose certain death to delay a much larger enemy force. "It makes no tactical sense," Nyx muttered, running calculations through his mental processors. They could have retreated, regrouped with their allies, and fought from a position of strength. Instead, they threw away trained warriors for symbolic value. But the real horror began when they reached the Peloponnesian War. The records described Greeks fighting other Greeks in a conflict that ultimately destroyed their entire civilization. Athens and Sparta, once allies against foreign enemies, turned on each other with a viciousness that shocked the alien observers. The siege of Melos particularly disturbed them. The Athenians had demanded the neutral islands submit to their rule, and when refused, they killed every adult male and enslaved all women and children. Not for resources or strategic position, but simply to demonstrate their power to other city-states. Dex had to leave the research chamber twice to compose himself, his scales cycling through colors that indicated extreme distress. "They destroyed their own people," he kept repeating. "Their own species turned on itself." The Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage introduced them to the concept of total war. The cadets read about Scipio's destruction of Carthage, where Romans systematically destroyed the city and salted the earth so nothing could grow there again. This went far beyond conquest or territorial expansion into something that could only be described as existential hatred. They wanted to erase Carthage from existence, Mira said, her voice hollow. Not just defeat them or take their resources. They wanted to ensure Carthage could never rise again. Nyx pulled up comparative data from other species' early conflicts. No other civilization in our records shows this pattern. Most early wars are about resources, territory, or survival. Humans seem to fight for abstractions like honor, revenge, and ideas. They spent hours analyzing the Roman conquests, watching as humans perfected the art of organized violence. The Roman legions didn't just defeat enemies, they made examples of those who resisted. The crucifixion of 6,000 rebels along the Appian Way after Spartacus's revolt served no strategic purpose except to terrorize anyone who might consider future uprisings. What disturbed the cadets most was humanity's simultaneous capacity for creation and destruction. The same Romans who built magnificent roads, aqueducts, and legal systems also perfected crucifixion, decimation, and other methods of maximizing suffering rather than simply achieving military objectives. They're not just efficient killers, Mira observed with growing horror. They're creative killers. They invent new ways to inflict pain and terror. The records showed gladiatorial games where humans forced prisoners to fight to the death for entertainment. The idea of turning warfare into public spectacle seemed alien to beings who viewed combat as a necessary evil rather than a source of amusement. As they delved deeper into Roman military history, they encountered the Jewish wars and the siege of Masada, where humans chose mass suicide rather than surrender. The concept of preferring death to defeat appeared repeatedly in human conflicts, suggesting a psychology that other species found incomprehensible. They would rather die than lose, Nyx whispered, his calculations unable to process the logic behind such decisions. From a survival perspective, it makes no sense. Dead warriors cannot fight future battles. By the end of their second research session, all three cadets were showing signs of psychological stress. Dex's scales had settled into a permanent gray of depression, while Mira sat in silence staring at the displays with haunted violet eyes. Nyx's arm patterns had become chaotic, reflecting his mental state as his logical frameworks failed to accommodate human behavior. They had covered only the first few centuries of recorded human warfare, and already their understanding of conflict had been fundamentally challenged. As they prepared to leave the research chamber, none of them spoke about what they had learned. The images of humans turning warfare into an art form of creative destruction would follow them into their dormitories and disturb their sleep cycles. Tomorrow, they would continue with medieval warfare, completely unprepared for the new horrors that awaited them in humanity's continuing evolution of organized violence. Steam rose from Nix's cooling vents as his internal processors worked overtime, trying to analyze patterns that defied mathematical logic. The three cadets had returned to their research chamber after a restless sleep cycle, hoping that human warfare might show signs of evolution toward more rational approaches. Instead, they discovered that technological advancement had only amplified humanity's capacity for creative destruction. The holographic displays now showed images from something called the American Civil War, and the cadets struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. Humans had turned their industrial revolution into a tool of warfare, mechanizing death on a scale that dwarfed their ancient conflicts. 600,000 casualties, Dex read from the summary statistics, his scales cycling through colors of disbelief. In a single war between people of the same nation, speaking the same language, sharing the same basic culture, Mira focused on the tactical reports, trying to understand the strategic thinking behind battles like Gettysburg and Antietam. They developed new weapons specifically designed to kill more efficiently, then threw massive armies against each other in direct frontal assaults. It's as if they wanted to maximize casualties rather than achieve military objectives. The records showed humans inventing rifled firearms, explosive shells, and primitive machine guns, then using these innovations to create battles where tens of thousands died in single days. The Battle of the Wilderness particularly horrified them, as wounded soldiers burned to death in forest fires started by artillery bombardments, while the fighting continued around their screams. Nix pulled up comparative analyses from other species' technological developments. Every other civilization in our database used improved weapons to achieve quicker victories with fewer casualties. Humans used better weapons to make their wars more destructive. They moved forward chronologically to World War I, and the displays filled with images that would haunt their memory circuits for the rest of their lives. The concept of trench warfare seemed designed to maximize suffering while minimizing strategic progress. Miles of fortified lines faced each other across landscapes, scarred by constant artillery bombardment. They spent 4 years fighting over strips of land measured in yards, Mira whispered, her silver skin pale with shock. Millions died to move the battle lines a few miles in either direction. The records detailed weapons that violated every galactic convention regarding the conduct of warfare. Poison gas attacks at Ypres and the Somme showed humans deliberately creating weapons designed to cause maximum pain rather than clean death. Chemical weapons that burned lungs, blinded eyes, and blistered skin served no tactical purpose that conventional explosives couldn't achieve more efficiently. Dex had to access medical databases to understand what mustard gas did to human physiology. His scales turned black with revulsion as he read descriptions of soldiers slowly dying from chemical burns to their respiratory systems. They created weapons specifically to make death as agonizing as possible. The cadets studied battle reports from Verdun, where French and German forces fed men into a meat grinder for 11 months, achieving nothing except demonstrating their willingness to accept unlimited casualties. The human concept of attrition warfare seemed designed to test which side could tolerate more suffering rather than achieve any meaningful military goal. "Look at these casualty figures," Nick said, his processor struggling with the mathematics of human sacrifice. The Battle of the Somme, 60,000 British casualties on the first day alone, for advances measured in hundreds of yards. Any rational species would have declared the offensive a failure and changed tactics. Instead, the records showed humans continuing the same tactics for months, apparently believing that enough death would eventually achieve breakthrough. The concept of going over the top into machine gun fire became a repeated pattern, as if humans viewed mass suicide as a legitimate military strategy. World War II introduced them to even more disturbing concepts. The records detailed strategic bombing campaigns designed to destroy civilian morale rather than military targets. The firebombing of Dresden and Tokyo showed humans deliberately targeting non-combatants to break enemy will to fight. They turned warfare against entire populations, Mira observed with growing horror. Not just armies fighting armies, but the systematic targeting of civilians to achieve military objectives. The Holocaust files required special psychological preparation warnings, and the cadets understood why after accessing the first data streams. The systematic extermination of millions of humans by other humans transcended warfare into something that had no galactic equivalent. The industrial efficiency applied to genocide showed a level of organized evil that broke several established psychological frameworks. Nix's cooling systems worked frantically as he processed the logistics of the concentration camps. They applied the same industrial methods they used for manufacturing to the systematic killing of their own species. This goes beyond warfare into something that has no tactical or strategic justification. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki introduced them to weapons that changed the fundamental nature of conflict. The cadets read about humans developing the power to destroy their own planet, then actually using these weapons against cities full of civilians. They built devices capable of ending their entire civilization, Dex said, his scales locked in patterns of terror. Then they used them, not as weapons of last resort when facing extinction, but to end a war they were already winning through conventional means. The records included footage of the mushroom clouds rising over Japanese cities, and technical specifications for weapons that could vaporize entire urban centers. The human scientists who built these devices seemed to understand their destructive potential but continued their work anyway. The project leader said they had become death, destroyer of worlds, Mira read from the historical accounts. They knew what they were creating and built it anyway. What truly disturbed the cadets was the realization that humans had weaponized their greatest strength, their technological innovation. Every advance in science and industry became a tool for more efficient destruction. Steam power drove warships, electricity powered communication systems for coordinating attacks, and chemical knowledge created new forms of poison gas. The progression, from swords to rifles to machine guns to nuclear weapons, showed an exponential increase in destructive capability, but the underlying human approach to warfare remained constant. They still fought for abstract concepts like freedom, democracy, and national honor, but now with the power to destroy continents. As they prepared to end another research session, the three cadets sat in stunned silence. The data they had reviewed covered less than 2 centuries of human technological warfare, yet already challenged everything they thought they knew about the relationship between advancement and civilization. "How are they not extinct?" Dex finally asked, his scales showing colors that indicated complete bewilderment. Any species this committed to perfecting the art of destruction should have eliminated itself long ago. Nix's arm patterns swirled in chaotic mathematical sequences as he tried to calculate survival probabilities for a species that had developed nuclear weapons. The statistical models don't work. They should have destroyed themselves multiple times over by now. Mira stared at the holographic displays showing mushroom clouds and wondered what horrors awaited them in the next phase of human history. Maybe they did destroy themselves. Maybe that's why their records seemed to end abruptly. None of them wanted to continue researching, but academic requirements demanded they push forward into humanity's Cold War era, completely unprepared for the psychological warfare and nuclear standoffs that would challenge their sanity even further. The medical bay of the Galactic Military Academy had never treated patients suffering from purely psychological trauma induced by historical research. Dr. Wellham, a Thessian healer with centuries of experience treating combat stress, found himself prescribing meditation cycles and memory-dampening treatments to cadets who had never seen actual warfare. Nix lay on a biobed designed for Nexari physiology, his arm patterns flickering weakly as technicians monitored his neural activity. The mathematical frameworks that defined his species' understanding of logic had suffered what could only be described as cascade failures when confronted with human strategic thinking during the Cold War period. "The numbers don't work," he mumbled, repeatedly as healing frequencies washed over his consciousness. They built enough weapons to destroy themselves 50 times over, then spent decades threatening to use them while hoping they never would. Dex occupied an adjacent healing chamber, his scales stuck in a pattern of muted gray that indicated severe depression. The Braxy worldview centered on direct confrontation and clear resolution of conflicts, but human proxy warfare had shattered his understanding of what it meant to fight. They never fought each other directly, he whispered to the medical attendants. They armed other species, other nations, and watched them destroy each other instead. How do you call that warfare? How do you call that honor? Mira had refused medical treatment, insisting that her Alteran heritage demanded she face the horror of human warfare without artificial assistance. She sat in the corner of the medical bay staring at nothing while her violet eyes processed images of nuclear weapon stockpiles that could sterilize entire star systems. Dr. Wellham reviewed their research files, trying to understand what had broken 3 of the Academy's most promising cadets. The Cold War record showed a level of psychological warfare that exceeded anything in galactic military history, combined with weapons policies that defied rational analysis. The concept of mutually assured destruction had particularly traumatized the research team. Most species, when faced with extinction-level threats, either surrendered to preserve their civilization or fought desperately to survive. Humans had chosen a third option, guaranteeing that any attack against them would result in the complete annihilation of both attacker and defender. They made extinction the consequence of aggression, Nix had explained before his logical processes collapsed entirely. Not victory or defeat, not conquest or liberation, but the end of both civilizations. Then they based their entire strategic doctrine on this promise of mutual suicide. The records showed humans maintaining nuclear arsenals capable of destroying their planet's biosphere multiple times over, while simultaneously developing space programs and advancing their civilization as if these weapons didn't exist. The psychological compartmentalization required to function normally while living under the constant threat of species extinction seemed impossible to other galactic minds. Dr. Wellham had consulted colleagues from dozens of species, but none had experience with the particular form of madness exhibited by Cold War humans. The closest parallel was the psychological condition called survival paradox syndrome, occasionally seen in individuals who continued functioning normally while knowing they carried fatal diseases. But humans had applied this mental state to their entire civilization. The proxy wars had damaged Dex's psyche most severely. His species understood warfare as direct confrontation between opponents with clear objectives and definitive outcomes. The idea of major powers fighting each other indirectly through smaller nations, supplying weapons and training while avoiding direct combat, seemed like cowardice elevated to strategic doctrine. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, Nicaragua, Dex had listed during his psychological evaluation. Humans armed different sides in conflicts across their planet, turning local disputes into testing grounds for their ideological differences. They used other people's blood to settle their arguments. The records showed superpowers spending decades and enormous resources supporting opposite sides in regional conflicts, achieving nothing except maximizing casualties among populations that had little stake in the larger ideological struggle. The mathematical models that Nix had relied upon to understand warfare completely broke down when applied to conflicts designed to continue indefinitely rather than achieve resolution. Mira's trauma centered on humanity's perversion of honor in warfare. The Cold War introduced concepts like nuclear brinkmanship, where political leaders deliberately brought their civilizations to the edge of total destruction to gain negotiating advantages in completely unrelated disputes. They played games with extinction, she had told Dr. Wellham during intake. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed humans willing to risk ending their entire species over the placement of weapons in a small island nation. They made ending everything a tool of diplomacy. The medical files included footage of human leaders calmly discussing nuclear exchange ratios and acceptable casualty levels in the millions, as if genocide were simply another policy option. The bureaucratization of apocalypse seemed to require a form of moral detachment that Alteran psychology couldn't process. Dr. Wellham found the space race particularly disturbing from a psychological perspective. Humans had developed rocket technology primarily for delivering nuclear warheads across continents, then used the same systems to explore space and eventually reach their moon. The transformation of tools of destruction into vehicles of exploration and discovery suggested mental processes that operated on multiple contradictory levels simultaneously. They turned weapons into exploration tools, the doctor noted in his report. The same rockets designed to carry nuclear death became the foundation of their space program. They literally beat swords into plowshares, then used the plowshares to reach for the stars while keeping the swords ready for immediate use. The treatment protocols had to be developed specifically for this case. Standard military psychology dealt with combat trauma and strategic stress, but no existing frameworks addressed the mental impact of studying a species that had deliberately chosen to live under the constant threat of self-imposed extinction while continuing to advance their civilization. The medical team consulted xenopsychologists, military historians, and even philosophers, but no one could explain how humans had maintained functional societies while building arsenals capable of ending their own existence. The paradox of nuclear deterrence required a form of collective insanity that somehow produced stability through the promise of mutual annihilation. Recovery sessions focused on helping the cadets understand that human behavior, while incomprehensible by galactic standards, had somehow worked for their species. The Cold War had ended without nuclear exchange, suggesting that human irrationality contained its own internal logic that prevented the ultimate catastrophe even while threatening it constantly. As the three cadets slowly recovered their mental equilibrium, Dr. Wellham prepared his report for Professor Kalin. The human warfare research had produced the first case of historical trauma in Academy records, requiring the development of entirely new treatment protocols for students exposed to militaristic thinking patterns that transcended conventional understanding. They are either the most insane species ever encountered, Dr. Wellham concluded in his assessment, or they possess a form of strategic wisdom so advanced that it appears as madness to less developed minds. Given that they survived their own weapons of mass destruction and somehow transitioned from the Cold War to spacefaring civilization, I suspect the latter interpretation may be correct. The three cadets would eventually return to their research, but they would never again approach the study of warfare with academic detachment. They had glimpsed into the mind of a species that had stared into the abyss of total destruction and somehow found the wisdom to step back, though the psychological cost of that wisdom remained beyond alien comprehension. The Academy's grand auditorium buzzed with unprecedented tension as representatives from 47 different species gathered for the most controversial presentation in institutional history. News of the human warfare research had spread through galactic diplomatic channels, creating a crisis that threatened the very foundations of interspecies cooperation. Dex stood at the central podium, his scales cycling through colors that reflected his nervous energy. Behind him, massive holographic displays waited to reveal the culmination of their research into humanity's military history. The three cadets had spent weeks preparing their final presentation, knowing that their findings would influence policy decisions affecting the future of galactic civilization. Ambassador Korvax of the Zephyrian Empire leaned forward in his observation booth, his crystalline form refracting the auditorium's lights into rainbow patterns. The Zephyrians had fought the bloodiest war in recorded galactic history, yet even they seemed disturbed by preliminary reports about human warfare capabilities. Before we begin our presentation, Dex announced, his voice carrying across the chamber through translation circuits, we must acknowledge that our research has revealed aspects of warfare that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of conflict and civilization. Mira activated the first display, showing a timeline of human warfare spanning thousands of years. The scope alone drew gasps from the assembled delegates, as most species' military histories covered centuries rather than millennia of continuous conflict. Humans have been fighting organized wars for over 5,000 years, she began, her silver skin reflecting the display's glow. In that time, they have developed approaches to warfare that appear unique among known galactic civilizations. The presentation began with ancient conflicts, and the audience watched in growing discomfort as the cadets described warfare for abstract concepts like honor, revenge, and ideological supremacy. The concept of 10-year sieges over individual persons or civilizations destroying themselves in civil wars violated most species' understanding of rational conflict. Nix took over for the technological warfare section, his arm patterns pulsing with mathematical precision as he detailed the exponential growth in human destructive capability. By their industrial age, humans had weaponized every scientific advancement, creating conflicts that killed millions while covering continents. The displays showed images from the world wars, and several delegates left the auditorium when footage of concentration camps appeared. The systematic application of industrial processes to genocide represented a level of organized evil that had no galactic precedent. They developed weapons capable of destroying their entire planet, Nix continued, then actually used them against their own species. Nuclear weapons fundamentally changed the nature of warfare from a tool of policy to a threat of extinction. The Cold War section produced visible distress among the assembled representatives. The concept of mutually assured destruction seemed to break several delegates' psychological frameworks, as species after species struggled to understand the logic of guaranteeing mutual annihilation as a form of peace maintenance. Ambassador, Corvex interrupted the presentation with a demand for immediate consultation. These findings suggest that humans represent an existential threat to galactic civilization. We request emergency sessions to consider preemptive containment measures. Similar calls erupted throughout the auditorium as representatives from peaceful species demanded that humanity be quarantined or worse. The idea of sharing the galaxy with beings capable of such creative destruction terrified civilizations that had evolved beyond warfare centuries ago. Professor Kalin rose from his position at the faculty table, his ancient presence commanding immediate silence. Before we discuss policy responses, perhaps we should allow the cadets to complete their presentation. They have uncovered information that may change your perspectives. Dex resumed speaking, his scales showing patterns of profound uncertainty. Our research revealed something unexpected. Human military records end abruptly approximately 50 years ago, with references to something called the Unity Wars. The displays showed fragments of data describing conflicts so devastating that complete records seem to have been deliberately erased. References to weapons that made nuclear arsenals seem primitive, casualty figures that approached total population percentages, and descriptions of warfare that had transcended physical destruction into something approaching spiritual annihilation. The poor Unity Wars appeared to have been humanity's final internal conflicts, Mira explained, her voice carrying notes of awe and terror. After these wars ended, there are no further records of human warfare against their own species. They seem to have collectively decided that warfare itself was obsolete. The auditorium fell silent as delegates processed this information. A species that had perfected the art of destruction more thoroughly than any known civilization had apparently chosen to abandon warfare entirely, not from weakness but from understanding its ultimate cost. Nix activated the final displays, showing recent human achievements in space exploration, terraforming, and peaceful technological development. Since ending their internal conflicts, humans have focused their industrial and scientific capabilities on exploration and construction rather than destruction. Professor Kalin approached the podium, his 6 eyes reflecting centuries of studying galactic warfare. The question before us is not whether humans are too dangerous for galactic society, but whether galactic society is prepared for allies who understand the true cost of victory. He activated a classified display showing recent communications from human representatives. The Galactic Defense Corps has received a formal application from Earth requesting membership in our alliance. They offer to share their military expertise in exchange for peaceful integration into our civilization. The implications hit the assembled delegates like a physical blow. Humans weren't asking to be protected by galactic civilization. They were offering to protect it. A species that had developed warfare beyond all rational limits was volunteering to defend others who had never faced such extreme threats. Consider this carefully, Professor Kalin continued. Every major galactic power has achieved peace through the elimination of external threats. The Zephyrians conquered all potential enemies. The Alterans established honor codes that prevented major conflicts. The Nexari calculated warfare into obsolescence through superior logistics. The holographic displays showed the current galactic map with potential external threats marked in red. Unknown species in distant star systems, signs of aggressive expansion from beyond the galactic rim, and the constant possibility of encountering civilizations that had not evolved beyond warfare. Humans achieved peace by understanding warfare so completely that they transcended it. They stared into the abyss of total destruction and chose to step back, not from fear, but from wisdom. When external threats eventually arrive, do we want allies who have never truly understood what it means to fight? Or do we want allies who have mastered warfare so thoroughly that they chose to abandon it? The vote that followed would reshape galactic civilization. After hours of debate and consultation with homeworld governments, the Alliance voted to accept humanity's application with only 3 dissenting voices. Ambassador Corvex cast the final vote, his crystalline form dim with exhaustion. We have seen the depths of human warfare, and we have seen their choice to rise above it. Perhaps they can teach us not just how to fight, but how to win so completely that fighting becomes unnecessary. As human ambassadors entered the auditorium for their formal admission ceremony, the assembled delegates observed them with new understanding. The humans carried themselves with quiet confidence, neither aggressive nor submissive, but with the bearing of beings who had seen the worst that intelligence could devise and chosen something better. The lead ambassador, a middle-aged woman, with gray-streaked hair and calm eyes, approached the podium where Professor Kalin waited with the formal alliance documents. Her voice carried across the chamber without amplification, speaking with the authority of someone who had earned wisdom through suffering. "We come before you not as conquerors or supplicants, but as guardians," she began. "Our species has walked the path of warfare to its ultimate conclusion. We have seen what happens when intelligence serves destruction rather than creation. We offer our experience not because we are proud of our history, but because we have learned from it." She gestured to her companions, each representing different aspects of human civilization. "We have turned our weapons factories into spacecraft manufacturers. Our military academies now teach conflict resolution alongside tactical studies. Our former soldiers become explorers, engineers, and teachers. The human delegation produced a data crystal containing their complete military archives, holding nothing back from their new allies. We share our knowledge freely, including our failures and our horrors, so that others might learn without experiencing the same costs. Our wars are ended, but our vigilance continues." Professor Kalin accepted the crystal with ceremonial gravity, understanding that he now held the most comprehensive record of warfare ever compiled by a single species. The Galactic Defense Corps welcomes humanity as full members, with all rights and responsibilities of Alliance membership. As the ceremony concluded, the 3 cadets who had begun this research project months earlier stood together in the observation gallery. Their understanding of warfare, civilization, and the relationship between power and wisdom had been fundamentally transformed by their encounter with human military history. Dex's scales showed the deep blue of profound respect mixed with lingering apprehension. They became the most dangerous species in known space, then chose to become something else entirely. Mira nodded, her violet eyes reflecting newfound wisdom about the nature of true strength. They mastered warfare so completely that they transcended the need for it. That may be the most honorable victory any species has ever achieved. Nyx's arm patterns swirled in equations that finally balanced, calculating probabilities for a galactic alliance protected by beings who understood both the necessity and the ultimate futility of warfare. The mathematics of their survival make sense now. They didn't avoid extinction through luck or accident. They chose to survive by choosing to change. As the human ambassadors mingled with their new galactic allies, the 3 cadets realized they had witnessed something unprecedented in galactic history, not just the admission of a new species to the Alliance, but the introduction of beings who had solved the fundamental paradox of intelligence, how to possess ultimate power while choosing never to abuse it. The Academy would redesign its entire military curriculum based on their research, incorporating human strategic thinking alongside traditional galactic approaches to conflict. Future cadets would study the Unity Wars as examples of how civilizations could choose to evolve beyond their destructive impulses without losing their ability to defend themselves when necessary. In the years that followed, when external threats finally did emerge from beyond the galactic rim, the Alliance would discover that their human allies brought more than military expertise to the defense effort. They brought the hard-earned wisdom of a species that had looked into the heart of absolute war and found the strength to choose absolute peace, while never forgetting the vigilance necessary to maintain it. The galaxy had gained not just powerful protectors, but teachers who could show other species how to win the only victory that truly mattered, the victory over their own capacity for senseless destruction.